2 Samuel chapter 11, Bible tells us here in verse number 1. This is, by the way, a message that definitely is uncomfortable to preach about. David starts out so good. He starts out with so many things going his way. And by the time you get to 2 Samuel chapter 11 and following, there's not many good things that are said about King David anymore. It's because of the things that he's allowed into his life for quite a few years before this time. And now he'll reap the results of that for many, many years to come. And some of his own family, many of his own children, end up not just rejecting the Lord, but rejecting David, rejecting their father, and really becoming very, very immoral and a terrible testimony of the Lord because of things that David allowed into his life, even at this time and before. Let's read 2 Samuel chapter 11. It came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. It came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him. And the story continues on of David's sin with Bathsheba. Let's open this morning in a word of prayer. Lord, I pray that you work in our hearts today. Help us to be careful about the things that we allow into our lives. Lord, help us to have eyes open this morning to realizing the terrible misery and tragedy that brings into our lives when we allow this kind of immorality into our lives. I pray, God, that you'd stir our hearts this morning and help us to make some good decisions this morning, that we personally are going to keep ourselves right in this area. I ask that you bless this time now. In Jesus' name I ask. Amen. David, what were you thinking? David, you had everything. You had the daughter of the king as your wife, Michal. Of course, she wasn't his only wife, but the Bible instructs us, and it hadn't come out to David yet, but the Bible is certainly clear. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 18, "Rejoice with the wife of thy youth." It's very normal, it's very natural for young people. Let me just start out by saying it's natural and normal for young people to get married. It's natural and normal for young people to love someone eventually. It's natural and normal for that physical relationship to be there. God made us that way. But the problem is the devil has come in and he's mixed things up. We call that perverted things. He's mixed things up to where now people want those things before the time. They want them before they're married. They want things that God has reserved for later when they're teenagers, and on and on and on. All the perversions of our society today. Well, David had the daughter of a king to wife. He had fame as a mighty man of valor. He was known as the one who slew the giant. He was known as the man of great faith. He was known as a person who had slain his 10,000s. At one time, he was supposed to kill 100 Philistines, and just for good measure, he went out and killed 200 Philistines, all by himself. He was a mighty man of valor. He'd been chosen of God. The Bible says he was a man after God's own heart. In my messages this year, I've talked about the many great things that David did. He was in God's will, doing God's work against God's enemies, and he ends up giving all that away for a few moments here and there of pleasure. Here in 2 Samuel chapter 11 is the account of his sin with Bathsheba, but it didn't start here. This is just one of the accounts of his adultery. Before there was Bathsheba, there was adultery with Abigail and Ahinoam and Haggith and Maacah, as well as some others. He married many wives. Everyone after the first one was adultery. He obviously lived in a world, maybe he thought that was acceptable. Maybe society had told them that that was okay. Society tells us many things, doesn't it? Tells us that it's great. I mean, it's honorable for a child to have two dads or two moms. I heard I think it was in the UK or somewhere, that they just, for the first time, Italy, that's where it was, where they recognized two mothers on the birth certificate. As if that's possible, you know. So that's normal. Culture says that's acceptable. Culture says, and I don't know I didn't look up the statistics because I hate seeing those kinds of statistics. What percentage of teenagers are sexually active? It's unbelievable. Culture says that's normal and that's acceptable. If you grew up in a public school, you know that that's normal and acceptable. Well, David lived in this kind of a culture also, where this was acceptable for kings to have many wives. Deuteronomy 17:17 says, "Neither shall he, the king, multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away." David, what were you thinking? You threw all of that away. But David didn't know the end of the story, did he? He didn't know the end of his family. He didn't know what was going to happen to one half, the half part wife and another part wife and their children. He didn't know all of these half brothers and sisters and what their relationships are going to be. But David, it all started with his thinking. He was thinking about what he could get. He was thinking about those women, and he was thinking about what he could do and how many wives he could have. He was thinking about it before he did it. David, what were you thinking? Paul Harvey tells a story about how an Eskimo sometimes kills a wolf. The account is pretty disgusting, but I think it's worth repeating. What he'll do is he'll take a knife, a sharp knife, about a 6-inch blade, and he'll cover it with blood. And he'll let that freeze on there, and then he'll put another layer of blood, and another layer of blood, and another layer of blood, until it's completely covered in blood. And he'll plant that thing out in the cold night, out in the ground, with the blade sticking up. And a wolf will come along and smell that, and he'll begin to lick that blood and love the taste. And you can guess the rest of the story. Boy, he just licks that knife, and he becomes obsessed with his love for the taste of blood. And before he doesn't even realize that he's actually has a little taste of a sting in his mouth as well. And it's, of course, the knife cutting his own tongue. And as he continues to lick that blood, little does he know, he's swallowing his own blood. And the next morning, they can literally come out there and there's a dead wolf on the ground. That's how our sin is. Our sin, boy, it just gives us a little taste, and it seems enjoyable for a little while. But that sin, and especially this idea this morning of a sexual sin, immorality, it gives you a little taste. Oh, this is good. This pornography that I can look at, boy, this is good. This makes me feel good. I like this. But you know what? It's deadly. It's deadly. And what we're going to see this morning, we're going to see how this misery that came upon the life of David was a result of his immorality and his immoral thoughts. And then we're going to see all those results that it brought about in his life. Our society says it's okay to look at pornography. You can look as long as you don't touch. I've heard people say that before. Oh, I'm just looking. I'm married, but I can just look. Oh, no. Our society thinks that's acceptable. And by the way, you're gonna see a lot of people. In your life, you're gonna read of a lot of people who have done these things, and you say, well, they're living a pretty good life, and so maybe it's not as serious as the preacher says it is. Well, just remember that you're just seeing one little glimpse of their life. You're seeing right at that moment in time that their life seems to be going pretty good, but you don't know what's actually going on in their lives. Well, you see these young people of today, our culture has these it's unbelievable, the perversion that is acceptable. The video games, the movies, whatever it is, man, it's just unbelievable how filthy it is. I remember going into houses before and you see these 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds playing the adult games and perversion. And you ask them to turn it off because it's so horrible. And this is their little child playing this game. I've seen it many times. Listen, we live in a society that says that's acceptable. How about the abortion argument? What's their main argument? If you can think about it, abortionists always say, well, it's a woman's body. She can do with it as she... And I know that's a terrible argument because it's not just her body. It's a separate... But that's their argument. And that argument to them makes sense. As long as I'm only affecting myself, I can do whatever I want. Somebody might look at pornography that way. Well, this is just me. If it's going to hurt anybody, it's just me. It's not going to affect anybody else. Right now, that might be the case. But in the long term, it always will affect you. It'll ruin you. It'll bring you to ruin. Immorality. What does immorality do to a person? That's my first main point this morning. What does immorality do to a person? You know, David was a great man, a great young man. But immorality changed him. It changed his family. It changed, I think, who he was as a person. Let me point out a couple things. His immorality brought reproach to the name of the Lord. David, that great man who had started out serving the Lord and doing great and unbelievable feats. All of a sudden, the Bible seems to indicate here in chapter 11 that his mind is like a cesspool. And it turns him into a savage, a lustful murderer. How did that happen? Started with evil thoughts. It started with the thoughts towards the other women who were not his wife. Just because the Bible doesn't really seem to condemn David having more than one wife until this chapter, doesn't mean that the Bible's against or not against it. Of course the Bible is against immorality and adultery. But what happened? His immorality brought reproach to the name of the Lord. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 now, verse 14. This is after the child is born to Bathsheba, and Nathan the prophet says to David, howbeit because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 32 and 33 says, but whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding, he that doeth it destroyeth his own soul. A wound and dishonor shall he get, and his reproach shall not be wiped away. Your sin of adultery or immorality, I believe it's in the passage, immorality always leads to that. I'm talking in a broad sense of any kind of immorality. It leads to other sins of immorality, and guess what? It brings reproach. It brought reproach to the name of Christ, not really just to David's name, but to the name of Christ. Listen, when Christians fall into adultery or fornication and they get caught with those things, it becomes a joke to the world. They say, see, you're just like us. And that's the truth. You're living just like they do, with their unbridled lusts and their unbridled desires. What they want, that's exactly what you want. You're living just like they do. Listen, we got to guard our desires, guard our thoughts. His immorality brought reproach. His immorality brought unbelievable regret. Regret. Boy, as I read the story of Absalom, and I'll get to that more in a second, but I just can't help but feel so sorry for him. If he could have seen a long time ago, seen this situation unfold with Absalom and his unbelievable regret, he would have never married Maacah, the mother of Absalom from Geshur. He'd have never married her. He'd have stayed away from this multiple wives thing. But he didn't see that ahead of time. And lots of times young people don't see that. That's what this message is really about, to warn you today. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 11, the Bible says in regards to the person who has a strange woman who commits immorality, it says, "And thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof." Listen, this person who is involved with the strange woman, he was mourning at the last. He was sad. He was heartbroken. He was full of grief. He said, "How could I do this thing?" I don't know how to describe this kind of grief other than the example that David has with Absalom. How about a person who, by mistake, totally by mistake, I've heard of this happening numerous times, a parent will leave their child in a hot car in the middle of the summer. Can you just imagine even the grief? We're talking an infant, realizing that that child of yours whom you love that they're dead because of what you did directly. Man, how heartbreaking. You have to just grab your heart out of your chest. You don't know what to do. That's the kind of regret that this immorality will eventually bring to a person. I was visiting just the other day with Davey out in Lake Station, and there was this lady who lives there, has lived there for many years. I'm sure she at one time was a pretty young lady. She's still fairly young, but the decisions that she's made a long time ago have brought her to the condition that she's in now. She has a terrible tooth problem, infection, awful, and she has no money to get her tooth removed. And as we left there, she was telling us all how just difficult it's been, and she's hardly slept for days and and she can't go to the dentist. She has no money. Nobody will take her. And as we left, I was thinking, the real problem here is that she, many years ago, as a teenager, I'm sure, started doing things that were immoral, and there was no guy that really loved her. Boy, they liked the pretty. She was beautiful, I'm sure. And she was wild and a partier and so on, but she went down that road, and lo and behold, now nobody loves her. No man is willing to live with her. Her husband has left her. She's had several husbands, I'm sure, and I know of a couple. And so her life is in ruins, and she doesn't know what to do. Listen, I feel sorry for her. Can you imagine I don't know if she realizes it, but the point I'm making is it started a long time ago. Boy, you just do things right. You wait for the Lord's person to come into your life, that man or that woman. They come into your life, and you get married to them, and you live a life that pleases the Lord, and God takes care of you. Boy, I wouldn't trade my position for anything like that. Obviously, you wouldn't either. What's the point? You better be on the right path while you're young. You better avoid the strange woman, young men. You better watch what you look at. You better watch what you think about. Better be careful. His immorality brought regret. His immorality ensnared him. Boy, isn't that the way it is? Just like that wolf. Listen, it's just like that blood that he gets a little taste for it. Boy, that's exactly how pornography works. You get a little taste, and you want a little more, and you want a little more. Listen, I'm reminded of a story of the ice chunks floating down the Niagara River in the springtime. And inside those chunks of ice, there's dead frozen fish. And these birds will come down, and they'll sit on those chunks of ice, and they'll eat out the dead fish out of the ice chunks. And boy, they'll get down close to the end of the Niagara River, and the bird will shake its big wings and fly away and got its nice treat and go find another chunk of ice. But sometimes there's a bird that sits on the chunk of ice too long. And as it comes down to the end of the Niagara or to the edge of the falls, it starts to move its wings, and it'll literally sometimes come up a little ways out of the water, but the ice is frozen to its feet. And it'll pull that ice up, but it cannot keep its distance, and it'll come back into the water, and down over the falls it goes. What happened? the thing that they love to have and their pleasure and their enjoyment, trapped them and ensnared them, and it took them to their death. Listen, that's how our sin will do. It'll give us a little taste, and it'll say, hey, this is great. Boy, there's nothing that works more like that than sexual sins. Listen, it just works that way. The devil will get a little hook, and he'll ensnare you and entrap you. I'm here to warn you this morning. You better be careful. Oh, I wouldn't do that. Boy, I come from a good family. I would never do. Oh, you better watch out. Boy, the devil, he'll trick you so fast. He'll get you in that trap, and boy, before you know it, you have this cesspool going on in your mind. It's a snare, it's a trap. Another thing, immorality brought this crippling guilt to David. I don't have time to look at all the passages. In 2 Samuel 13, let me just tell you the stories real quick. Amnon molests his half-sister, more perversion. Absalom's full sister. David does nothing to punish this sexual sin. Why? Maybe it's because he feels like he has no moral authority to speak out against immorality. And I'm sure that's the case. He realizes that he has been immoral, and his children are going to say, David, you were immoral. I mean, what's the big deal? I'm not as bad as you, Dad. I didn't take another man's wife and kill the man. David's guilt keeps him from speaking up against Amnon and his molestation. In 2 Samuel 13, then, Absalom kills his half-brother Amnon and then flees to his mom's side of the family. And David, I'm sure he said, how can I speak up against Absalom now? Because I married his mother. I'm the father of Absalom and the husband of his mother. How can I do this? And so he's too guilty to speak up against Absalom. In 2 Samuel 14, Absalom comes back to Jerusalem pretending to want to make things right. And what's kind of baffling to me is that in Psalm 51, you see David coming to God and confessing his sins, and Lord, please forgive me. He's quick to make things right with God. But when Absalom comes back into town, he's not quick to make things right here, in this case, with his own family. Why? I think it's the same thing. He's guilty. Sin does that. It makes you feel, the devil, he just does circles around us. He makes us feel guilty to the point where we are afraid to speak out against sin. And he'll also make us look like a fool, and he'll laugh at us the whole way. What's the devil doing? He's playing mind games with us. And David has forgiveness available to him, but he doesn't go on that. He is guilty. In 2 Samuel chapter 18, we then see Absalom finally coming to the end. And what happens to him, of course? He's caught by his hair, his long hair. I've always been against hair. He's caught by his long hair, hanging there in an oak tree. Joab comes along and kills him, drops him into a hole in the ground. And go to verse number 33, the end of 2 Samuel chapter 18. Here's David waiting for news. He wants to have Absalom's rebellion against the kingdom. He wants to have that put down. But he wants to keep Absalom alive. Again, his guilt. His guilt. He knows that this is his son who has rebelled against him personally. And so David feels the weight of this responsibility. And in verse 33, when he finds out that Absalom is dead, the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee. Oh, Absalom, my son, would God I had died for thee." David knew that it had all started with him. It was his fault. He started this whole downward progression of sin and of lust and of desire for other men's wives. And instead of being happy and rejoicing with the wife of his youth, which the Bible does actually say that Michal loved David, instead of rejoicing with the wife of his youth, he let his mind stray. And now we come to the end of his son Absalom's life. And David says, I wish, truly, his heart just coming out of his chest, I wish I could die in your place. I deserve it. You don't. I started this whole thing. You didn't start it. Listen to me. Right now, you can look at your pornography and you say, oh, I'm doing pretty good. You can do your thing. You can sneak around. You can do whatever. Listen, I hope that it doesn't happen. I hope it's not happening, but I have a brain, and I think there's people around here that do. Listen, you can do those things and think you're getting away with it. And one day you're going to come to this place in your life. I believe that. You're going to come to the place where your own children, by the way, there's nothing more special than your own family. And the path you put your children on, boy, you better make sure it's the right path, because that path can end up in this place. And your children hate you, and your children reject the Lord. And Absalom, as far as we know, David, I really believe David knew that Absalom was burning in hell. That Absalom had rejected the Lord, and now it was David's fault because of his lust. Let me give you some biblical guidelines in the few minutes I have left to avoid the regret of immorality. Some biblical guidelines. The first one, some of you, you'll think, what? Listen to this. Learn to live under commandments and laws. Learn to live under commandments and laws. That is throughout the Bible. When you rebel against regular rules and commandments, especially of your parents, it leads to immorality. That is a fact. Turn to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20. I'll give you a couple examples here real quick. Proverbs chapter 6, verse number 20. People who don't like to obey authority often are led to immorality. Proverbs chapter 6, verse number 20. My son, keep thy father's commandment and forsake not the law of thy mother. Bind them continually upon thine heart and tie them about thy neck. Them is referring to the commandments and laws. Verse 22, when thou goest, it shall lead thee. It is referring to the commandments and laws. When thou sleepest, it shall keep thee, and when thou awakest, it shall talk with thee. Still talking about the commandments and laws. Next verse. For the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light. Commandments and laws. Lamp and light. And reproofs of instruction are the way of life, semicolon. When you learn to listen to your parents and you learn to listen to authority, to keep thee from the strange woman, from the flattery of the tongue of a strange woman. Lust not after her beauty in thine heart. What's the point? People who don't have self-control, their body tells them what to do. They become perverted. They become immoral because they don't tell their body, their flesh, no. It's the natural thing to them. You do what feels good. You do what seems good. Everybody else is doing it. I mean, I'm in control, just like those who are smoking. They could quit any time, right? That's what they always say. Listen, this rejection of commandments and laws leads to immorality. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 11. Here's another case of this. Proverbs chapter 5, verse number 11. I actually go back a few verses. Verse number 3 is the beginning of the passage. For the lips of a strange woman. So it begins to talk about this strange woman, and her end and her feet go down to death, verse 5, and so on. Verse 8, remove thy way far from her. Verse 10, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth. You better not listen to that strange woman. You better stay away from her. Now look at verse 11. And thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, how have I hated instruction. Those who hate instruction turn immoral. Look again at 1 Kings chapter 1. Well, let's not turn there. 1 Kings chapter 1 is a story where David's about to die, and he's passing the kingdom on to his son. And lo and behold, one of his sons, he's passing the kingdom to Solomon. Adonijah comes along and says, Dad, I want to marry your concubine. That's disgusting. That's one of his father's sub-wives. Hate to call them that, right? One of his wives, his concubines. And the son wants to marry the father's concubine. You say, well, what was wrong with Adonijah? Well, verse 6 tells us very clearly, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, the Bible says that David had not restrained his son Adonijah at any time. So Adonijah said, hey, if Dad's not going to restrain me in anything else, then I can have this perversion as well. See, it leads, when you don't listen to authority, it leads to immorality because it's a lack of self-control and you're just doing what seems right, what seems natural anyway. You just do it. You better learn to listen to authority. Live under commandments and laws. Next, avoid any opportunity to commit sexual sins. Avoid opportunities to commit immorality. Boy, you better watch yourself. I'm thankful for the chaperones that took me on off-campus dates. Thankful for those. Are you kidding? I know my flesh. I hope you know yours as well. Be thankful for those things. You know what, our society, have you ever tried to tell somebody who doesn't go to a place like this and tell them that you have chaperones who go on dates? Oh, they'll think you're nuts. There's something wrong with you, you know. Are you even a human being? Do you have red blood flowing through you? They're going to make fun of you. Society says you're crazy. Avoid opportunities to commit immorality. What did Joseph do? Man, he tried to always have somebody around him. And then one time, Potiphar's wife had everybody leave, and he was the only one in there. And in that case, he said, how can I commit this great wickedness and sin against God? He stood, but what did he always do? He tried to keep other people around. He tried to avoid any possible opportunity. Boy, young people, listen. Waiting for that right mate and that wedding altar and that wedding ceremony and that first kiss is the most beautiful thing that God ever created. A new family. It's the best thing God ever made. Don't let the devil fool you into thinking you can get a little taste ahead of time. It doesn't work that way. God's blessing comes when you wait for His timing, and you wait for His timing in this area especially. Wait for God's timing. You say, well, I've already sinned. I've already looked at things. My mind has become already, like you say, a cesspool. You know what you need to do? Confess and forsake. Confess and forsake. Psalm 51 is a great passage. Psalm 32, I don't have time, I'm out of time, but Psalm 32, give that to the Lord. Confess it and bring it to the Lord and truly give it to Him. Listen, it's a trap. You're going to have to dig your way out. You're going to have to get some help. You're going to have to ask somebody for some help. But get out of that trap. Boy, we have a big, strong bear trap there in the dorm. At least we used to. I think it's still there. Man, if that thing ever gets on your ankle, that'd be impossible, I think, for you personally to get it off yourself. You need help. Listen, in this trap especially, more, I think, than any other trap, teenagers, if you're in a trap like this, you've got to have help and get out. But man, I would say, first of all, don't ever get into it. Avoid it. Stay out of it. Know where the traps are. Know where there is even a possibility that you could get caught in this trap. There's technology everywhere, right? Easy access to wickedness and sin. Boy, you better not have one of those things unless you can block it and guard it and protect it. Boy, you got to avoid those opportunities. And then also, you got to realize God's forgiveness. God's forgiveness is not a license so you can do it again. God's forgiveness is so you can move beyond the guilt. David didn't remove himself from that guilt, I don't believe. And so he let his children go, and he lost his family because he didn't get over the guilt of what he personally had done. Realize God's forgiveness. It's a great song, Marvelous Grace of Our Loving Lord. Grace that exceeds our sin and our guilt. Romans 6 says that the grace of God is bigger than our sin. Yonder on Calvary's mount outpoured, there where the blood of the Lamb was spilt. The last verse says, dark is the stain that we cannot hide. What can avail to wash it away? Look, there is flowing a crimson tide. Whiter than snow you may be today. And this sin, this dark stain of immorality, it's a reproach that can't be wiped away, but you can have the sin forgiven. You absolutely can. And you can get victory over this through the power of the blood of Christ, the grace of God. Let's have our heads bowed and our eyes closed this morning. Listen, this invitation this morning, it's not for those who are entrapped in the snare of pornography necessarily, even though it's certainly for you. This invitation this morning is for every one of us to make a decision that we're going to avoid the snare. We're going to avoid completely any temptation, any possibility of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I know there's certainly times where you can't avoid that. Joseph was in that situation. He couldn't avoid it. But listen, when you're careful, I believe like Joseph was, when you're watching and trying to make sure that you keep things out of your life that shouldn't be there, when you're being careful, God's going to help you. And God's going to protect your mind. And God's going to give you the victory like you did Joseph. Won't you make some decision this morning that you're going to be careful. And if you are caught in this terrible trap, boy, that you're going to get the victory over it through God's power. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for this.